Hello and welcome to The Late Show. Today is Wednesday, the 29th of April, 2020. Today is a very special day in Israel because today is Israel's National Independence Day. And in Hebrew, that is known as Yom Ha'atzmaut, where Israel is celebrating her 72nd birthday as a nation reborn according to the Jewish calendar. So I have two special guests here today to discuss Israel at 72. I'm joined by my good friend Michael McCann, from the director of Israel-Britain Alliance, sporting a new beard and new look for us, as well as Alistair Scott, the UK director for the European Coalition for Israel. So, gentlemen, warm welcome to the programme.
Hi, Simon. To be here.
And I'm just going to run through some incredible statistics as Israel reflects upon her 72 years as a nation reborn according to Bible prophecy. So according to the Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, Israel's population currently stands at 9.2 million today. That's an increase of over 171,000 people since last year. Israel's population is 74% Jewish and 21% Arab. Israel's population is projected to reach 11.1 million by the year 2030. And by 2048, when Israel turns 100, her population is believed to be predicted as 15.2 million. There were 180,000 babies born since last year, and there's been a total of 40,000 deaths in Israel, and 32,000 people have made Aliyah to Israel. Since 1948, 3.3 million Jews have made Aliyah to Israel, and 44% of that number have arrived after 1990. And my final statistic is in 1948, only 6% of world Jewry lived in Israel, and now that figure is 45%. And the total global Jewish population is 14.7 million. So all we can say to Israel is happy birthday. But let's have a look now at those historical events that led up to the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, declared independence after the British mandate expired.
May 14th, 1948, 4 p.m., Tel Aviv. On a small podium stands a determined Zionist leader before a hastily convened gathering, reading out a proclamation which would change the course of history. This is how the State of Israel was born. First, a bit of background. At the end of World War I, the Allied powers gained control over the Middle East, including the land of Israel. The League of Nations recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people to their land and granted Great Britain a mandate to help them reconstitute a national home. However, Arab riots and geopolitical considerations led to a series of British restrictions on Jewish development and immigration. Even ships, including displaced children and Holocaust survivors, were sent back to Europe. Jewish resistance grew as well. By 1947, the ball was back in the United Nations Court, where a majority of the nations decided on November 29th, after a tense vote, to divide the land into a Jewish and an Arab state. The Jews rejoiced. The local Arab population, well, they launched a war throughout the country. May 15th, 1948 was the date the British mandate officially ended, the date the Jewish state was to be declared, and the date 5 regular Arab armies planned a coordinated attack to annihilate the newborn state. On May 12th, David Ben-Gurion convened the People's Council. The atmosphere was grave. Moshe Sharett reported that the Americans are demanding a postponement of the declaration, or else they would not help Israel against the United Arab invasion. Golda Meir reported that King Abdullah had retracted his original agreement and will join the attack. Military leaders expressed serious doubts about the ability of the small Jewish community to withstand 5 regular Arab armies equipped with European weaponry. But somehow, after 13 hours of deliberations, Ben-Gurion succeeds in swaying the balance against the American demand. And on Friday, May 14th, In the presence of local Jewish leaders, he declares the establishment of the State of Israel. The proclamation, which was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, asserted the historical and moral rights of the Jewish people in its historic homeland
and defined Israel as a Jewish democratic state.
based on equal rights, freedom, and justice. The declaration ended with a call on Jews to return home and extended a hand for peace towards the local Arab population and neighboring Arab countries. The Arab invasion was immediate and lasted for over a year. Close to 50% of Israel's small fighting force were survivors of the Nazi death camps who vowed never again. 1 out of every 100 Jews living in Israel died in the fighting. But by the end of the war, the small Jewish state had emerged victorious as an independent nation in this homeland for the first time in 2,000 years.
And there's plenty more excellent videos like that on YouTube. Now, what is extraordinary is that President Truman, who recognized the modern state of Israel against the advice of his own State Department and against the advice of US intelligence, believing that the nation of Israel would only survive 1 week. How wrong they were, as Israel's here 72 years later after she declared independence. So I'm now going to be joined by Alistair. Alistair, as the nation of Israel celebrates her National Independence Day, known in Hebrew as Yom Ha'atzmaut, and Israel has turned 72, what does the nation of Israel mean to you, and when did the Lord really give you a heart and love and a passion for his people and his land?
Well, the first thing to say is Hag Sameach to all those from Israel or the Jewish community watching. Happy birthday to Israel. Yes, I was very, very blessed because I wasn't born, fortunately. I'm not that old when the Independence Day was actually announced in 1948. But as a young teenager during the 60s, I was brought up as part of a pretty religious family that went to church regularly on Sundays. And I went through the rebellious teenage stage of thinking I don't want to be there and so on. But when the war of 1967 happened, I think I must be about 13 then, 13 going on 14. And I just had a supernatural interest in what was going on. And the story of David and Goliath, all those things I had studied in Sunday school before, became real because this was a real David-Goliath story. Because a small nation of a very, very small population with a beleaguered small army being attacked by a huge enemy or nations together. And yet somehow they came through. And for me, it was an amazing time. And it birthed in my heart a real desire and love for Israel, even though at that point I'd never been there. And it was only several years later, really, that when I became a born-again believer and studied the Bible, I understood more and more how important this little nation, this pinpoint of a nation in the world, is as part of our history and the destiny of all the nations of the earth. So it was an exciting time, really, for me and my wife too. We both became real strong lovers of Israel. We started to support works in Israel. We did in our churches and our ministry, we were teaching about Israel in many nations. But it was like in those very, very early days, it was just God really putting a fire in my heart about something I didn't know much about. Because certainly in the traditional church we were in, all I knew about Israel was, Bethlehem was the place where Jesus was born, and Jerusalem was the place where he was crucified. My picture of Jesus wasn't of a Hebrew man. It was probably a Hollywood Jesus, with blue eyes and long blonde hair. But God is amazingly gracious, and he chooses who he wants to choose in order to impart revelation
We're now joined by Michael McCann. Michael, you've been a strong supporter of Israel as a Labour MP, standing up for Israel in Parliament and also the Jewish people. And you have also successfully built a very good political organisation called Israel-Britain Alliance, where you are mobilising grassroots support for Israel and the Jewish people. So what does Israel mean for you as she reaches her 72nd birthday?
I just think it's a tremendous success story in life generally, and particularly in politics. You make mistakes, you make decisions that you regret, things that you would have liked to have done a different way. And when you support Israel as a politician, let me tell you, Simon, you are insulted, you're derided, and you're accused of all sorts of scurrilous acts in the process of defending the state of Israel. But I haven't for one moment regretted supporting the state of Israel, both as a politician and now, I think even more, I can show my support for Israel through the work of the Israel-Britain Alliance, because not only can I show my support for Israel, but we are now the catalyst for tens of thousands of people across the United Kingdom showing that support for Israel, and doing so today on its 72nd birthday.
Excellent. Now, this is a good quote. I got this today from the website belonging to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and I'll just read it to you. They said that Independence Day is a celebration of the renewal of the Jewish state in the land of Israel, and that throughout history, the yearning to return to the land of Israel has been the focus of Jewish life. Therefore, Independence Day is the celebration of the renewal of the Jewish state in the land where the Jewish people began to develop its distinctive religion, culture, some 4,000 years ago. Now, there are not many nations around that can celebrate 4,000 years of history and heritage. How remarkable do you think it is that actually in the lifetime of many of us, we've seen this ancient nation come alive again 72 years ago?
Well, I think it's pretty extraordinary, and I think when you look at the supporter base of the Israel-Britain Alliance, the demographics support exactly what you've said, because there are people alive today that remember 1948. There's most definitely a whole generation that remember 1967. I remember speaking to Jim Shannon, who's a member of Parliament for Strangford, and Jim remembers watching the black and white TV pictures of the Six-Day War and then the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So there's people who have their whole lives have been premised by the fact that Israel was reborn, and they've watched it grow in its success every single year in every single possible field, from Nobel Prize winners in science and medicine to great things that it's given our planet. And so therefore I think it's unique in the global stage.
So let's have a look at how Israel as a nation has actually fulfilled biblical prophecy.
I think we have a privilege of seeing with our own eyes the words of the book materializing and becoming a reality. In the history of mankind, there has never been a nation that has left its homeland and returned to its homeland. Not after 2,000 years.
In 1916, when my grandfather first moved to Israel, there were 60,000 Jews in Israel. Exactly 100 years later, there are over 6 million. Never in the world has there been a population explosion from 60,000 to 6 million as we've seen here in the land of Israel. It's unprecedented. Something is happening of historic proportions.
The world's actually constantly going through changes, but I think we're experiencing a hyper switch. Something's moving quicker.
We're living in times of prophecy. It says, I will bring you in from the four corners of the earth, and people will know that you are my people and that I am your God.
Here we see something so epic, so huge, so historic, promised in the Bible.
It's something that people couldn't have imagined 50 years ago.
God says in Jeremiah, no more am I going to be known as a God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm going to be known as the God who brought you out of the land of the north and the other countries. And when he brought back the people from the land of the north, from Russia, he was saying something else. He's saying, no more am I going to be known as the God of history. I'm going to be known as the God of now. Open up your eyes, watch it happening. I'm on the move.
There are more Jews studying the Bible today than ever before in Israel's history. Every single promise is now coming to pass in our lifetime. And what that does is it inspires people to want to be a part of it. They feel a calling on their life to say, if God is with Israel, then either I'm moving to Israel or I'm standing with Israel. I'm helping Israel. I'm supporting Israel. I want to be a part of that.
Some truly feel I have the opportunity to be part of what God is doing in this land. And that doesn't only mean Jews. That means those that stand with God wherever they are.
When Isaiah said that all the nations will be streaming like water to the Temple Mount, he was talking about you, from Missouri, from Washington, from California, from Brazil, from Tunisia, from Indonesia. So if you want to connect to the essence of the whole thing, the place where God chose to lay his divine presence, you got it. This is it.
With the dawn of each new day, life is returning to the land of the Bible. And around the world, millions of believers are feeling drawn to this place. Now is the time to chart your own journey, to discover for yourself the miracle of the land and the courageous hearts of the people of Israel.
I am 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 Israel. I am Israel.
So we can see from that extraordinary video that the nation of Israel has been fulfilling biblical prophecy. And what it means is that we're ushering into the last days, and we're seeing that God's word is dependable. And when God makes a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, these are being fulfilled in our day. Michael, can you share with us your first experience of visiting the land of Israel?
Sure. It was a parliamentary delegation in 2010. We visited with Labour Friends of Israel, and many of the people who are still in Parliament today were alongside me, people like Rachel Reeves, Jonathan Evans, and Dan Jarvis. And what Labour Friends of Israel do is give you a whole landscape of the country and the problems that Israel faces. It gives you the opportunity to see all the great things that go on inside Israel in terms of technology, medicine. We visited hospitals, we visited high-tech firms, we visited organisations and companies building electric cars. That was back in 2010. And then you start to get a measure of the problems that Israel faces in terms of the geography, how close, and that was the thing that really impacts upon you immediately, when you see how close Israel is to the neighbours who seek its destruction. And it makes it all the more extraordinary that it survived from 1948. Not only survived, it's flourished from 1948 through to today, where we can celebrate its 72nd birthday.
Absolutely. And when we look at Israel, Michael, and we look back at those early days of the recreation of the modern state of Israel back on the 14th of May 1948, when David Ben-Gurion made that famous declaration in Tel Aviv that he declared independence after the British mandate had expired. Then Israel was attacked by 5 Arab armies, and no one really believed that this new nation stood a chance. And yet here we are 72 years later, and Israel's flourishing. Even more remarkable, isn't it, the fact that Israel's been surrounded by enemies who have wanted to destroy her, the likes of the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Syrians, and that Israel has really fought 5 major wars for her survival, but actually came out of this and flourished. And today, Israel is not only military powerhouse, but also an economic power in the Middle East. And I think one of the most remarkable things in all this is that Israel lives in the most hostile region of the world, and yet Israel can celebrate her democracy, democratic institutions, human rights, freedom of press, everything that is precious in a Western democratic nation, and everything that we hold dear with those values. How impressive is it that under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, that Israel became the only democracy and is still the only democracy in the Middle East today?
I think David Ben-Gurion is one of the top figures in history. Not only a humble man, highly intelligent, listened to others, and a fantastic example of taking decisions on a collective basis for the good of the new country that he was just about to lead, because an election took place just after the announcement that Israel was going to be a new state. And we shouldn't forget that crucial history from the United Nations voting to recognise and to establish a state of Israel at the end of 1947. The Arab nations, because remember, there were no Palestinians, the Arab nations rejecting that offer of a state. And then the build-up to the 15th of May, when the British were scheduled to leave the mandate of Palestine, David Ben-Gurion is told before the 14th of May not to declare independence. The Americans urged him not to do so. The CIA assessment was that Israel, the nascent state, would be destroyed within 7 days. The British Foreign Office shared the same view. Against all the odds, David Ben-Gurion made that announcement. They were a ramshackle band of 3 different groups of fighters who had fought against Arab insurgency before the declaration of independence, and they won against all the odds. And I defy anybody to tell me that isn't providence.
Absolutely. And also what was extraordinary as well is that after Israel declared independence and a year later actually defeated those 5 Arab armies in her war of independence, what we saw then was an economic blockade by Israel's neighbours. So Israel then had to trade and compete with Europe and also the United States. How much do you think that economically that Israel had to compete with Europe and America in order to gain a competitive advantage in terms of economy actually helped Israel rise up from the poverty of the Middle East to be what Israel is today, and that's an economic powerhouse?
Well, we have to remember that back then it was an agrarian economy. It was based on David Ben-Gurion's vision, is that they would become self-sufficient in crops. They would sell those crops, and that was something with the whole concept of kibbutz that lasted for a number of years. But I think what we should always bear in mind, because if you said that there was no violence associated with the ascendancy of the State of Israel, you would still think it was an extraordinary story about how this small country in the southeastern shores of the Mediterranean had done so much in such little time, when you consider some of the tin butt dictatorships that have come and gone and during that period in Africa and South America and so on and so forth. So Israel had to transform from an agrarian economy to a high-tech economy. And they made that transition successfully, despite the fact that in the very early days, they were up against every possible obstacle you could think of in terms of how they could make a success of their nation. And remember, the armistice that was signed in 1949, that was a ceasefire, it was a truce. That time was meant to be bought to find peace. But we know that the Arab nations that surrounded Israel had no intentions of finding peace and were just waiting for the next opportunity to attack, which they did. Or they prepared to attack in 1967 before Israel carried out the defensive strike. Then they did nearly succeed in 1973, in the eve of the most important holiday for the Jewish faith, which is, of course, Yom Kippur. They nearly succeeded them, but they were defeated. And again, I would argue that's providence.
Absolutely. And Michael, I suppose we have to ask the question, I mean, David Ben-Gurion, and this program really is about celebrating the leadership of Israel's first prime minister, actually had the insight to see that the only way that Israel would survive as a nation would be to align herself with a major power. And Israel did that by aligning herself with the United States, and to have that support from American Jewry as well was also very important for Israel's survival. But in terms of military help, we see that it really wasn't until after the Six-Day War of June 1967 that Israel received military help and assistance from the United States, not before. And that prior to that, it was the nation of France that was Israel's biggest military supporter in terms of supplying her the military hardware in order to fight not only after the War of Independence, but the 1956 Suez War, and also in preparation for the start of the June 1967 war, known as the Six-Day War. How important do you think politically it was to come to that decision to have a major power back the new modern state of Israel?
I think it was important. I think in modern history, there's been a series of Cold War and post-Cold War events where countries have been used as proxies. One can think of the battles in Afghanistan, and you have the Russians favouring a relationship with the Syrians and Assad because they want to counterbalance the relationship that the Israelis have with the Americans. But I think the crucial difference is this. Soviet Russia and then the Russian Federation, had a relationship with Syria which was based in one dictatorship to another dictatorship, which is fundamentally different to America, a democracy, the leading democracy in the world, aligning itself to another democracy in Israel. And we've seen over the years, in terms of the relationships between American presidents and Israeli prime ministers, there's not always been complete agreement. There's always been a deep and strong relationship there. But we only need to think back to Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu, where there was severe and important differences of opinion on things like Iran's nuclear capabilities and what the world should be doing to stop them. So it's been a very strong relationship. And I think what's made it stronger is that the democracy, which is the foundation of the state of Israel, which makes it different from any other nation that you could lay claim to in terms of the different relationships between countries around the world.
And Michael, on the concept of Israel's democracy, I mean, Israel has an incredibly vibrant democracy, as you and I know, having filmed in the Israel's parliament, the Knesset, a couple of years ago. But one thing is very, very striking is the way that Israel's political system is set up with its proportional representation. Israel has always has a coalition government. Do you think this is because this reflects the diversity of thinking and views within Israeli society, that Israel had to do that, and that Israel probably wouldn't cope very well with, for example, in Britain or the United States, by having two dominant political parties? What are your thoughts?
Well, I from a personal perspective, I don't favour the proportional representation system, and I think it was something that was created in the early days of Israel, and because it's been in place for so long, it's very difficult to move away from that. But even in the recent history of the country and its politics, we've had several general elections. We have this incredibly difficult barrier for political parties to, as individual groups, to win a majority. It's never been heard of. They have to form coalitions, and the whole weakness of the proportional system is that you have to then give up your principles in order to secure a political deal. And we've seen that take place where I think Netanyahu was very clever in terms of his negotiations with Gantz. He waited for the blue and white coalition to collapse before he could then move in and have a much stronger position politically to move forward with his agenda. I think in many respects, had Israel had a first past the post electoral system similar to Britain, and you had more of a left-right split where individuals would then make a judgment based on those politics, I think Israel could arguably be even stronger. But we are where we are. The proportional representation system's in place. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. I think it'll be a very difficult thing to change the constitutional framework of the country. But nonetheless, it's another, or it's testament to Israel's success that they've still managed to make a success of their democracy with a, in my opinion, fundamentally flawed system.
Absolutely. And what was so extraordinary is that a few years ago I had the pleasure of being in Israel for Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Day of Independence celebrations, and to be in the streets of Tel Aviv, surrounded by so many Israelis waving the Israeli flag and partying and being very happy, and it's an amazing day of celebration. We now have this really nice video produced by the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, where they are sending best wishes and birthday wishes to the people of Israel from around the world as Israel celebrates her 72nd birthday.
Feliz Día de la Independencia, Israel!
Bonne fête d'indépendance, Israël! Happy Independence Day, Longjubilalo, Israel!
Gratulerer med dagen, Israel!
С Днем независимости, Израиль!
Happy Independence Day, Israel.
Israel, herzlichen Glückwunsch zum Unabhängigkeitstag.
Een gezegende onafhankelijkheidsdag, Israël.
Maligayang araw ng kalayaan, Israel.
Israel, 独立纪念日快乐!
Wakanoy na dinaka ni singa ni tuba kay koya e Israeli.
Tuba itsenasu staiva Israel.
स्वतंत्र दिवस की शुभकामनाएं इस्राएल. We love you, we stand for you.
And sadly, it won't be like that for Israel today because of COVID-19. Sadly, we've lost Alistair Scott's connection due to connection problems. So just be Michael and myself for the rest of the programme. Michael, it's going to be very difficult for Israelis this year, isn't it? Because the Israelis love to have picnics and barbecues. They like to go out to the country. It's a big national celebration. And yet Israel, like the rest of us, is in lockdown because of COVID-19. So how do you think Israel will be celebrating her 72nd birthday, but this time indoors?
Yeah, I think the celebrations are fantastic and Israeli Independence Day. Unfortunately, I've only seen it on video rather than in real life. I haven't been as fortunate as you, Simon. But I'm sure that across the state of Israel today, families will be celebrating the 72nd birthday of the country, and they'll be changing the celebrations, but they'll be recognising that they're doing it for a good reason, to prevent the spread of this terrible disease which has got hold of the world at the moment. I think the good news is that I've been reading recently that the Israeli government has started to lift restrictions, obviously maintaining social distancing, but opening some local shops. So that's a first good sign. So once again, Israel is, if you like, leading the way in terms of not only trying to find a vaccine for this terrible disease, but also, recognising and showing the way forward about a phased recovery and how we can start to get back to, if it's not going to be normal life, then a new normal.
Absolutely. And one thing I find extraordinary about Israelis on the whole is that they have this tremendous big hearts. Not only are they incredibly hospitable people, but they're also very, very generous. And we also see that Israel wants to make the world a better place. And the classic example of this really is, and sadly this hasn't got the news coverage that it deserves, is the fact that Israel went out of a way, put soldiers at risk to help the injured Syrians caught up in the Syrian civil war, and actually helped Syrians over into Israel's border, where they have a medical tent where they actually treat injured Syrians right on Israel's border and then send them back into Syria. And also the fact that Israel sends out military operations of actually flying into hostile Arab nations that don't recognise her right to exist, like Syria, and help Palestinian children get heart transplants, and including those of the Hamas leaders who vow for Israel's destruction. Israel was providing their children with medical care so that they can survive. Michael, Israel is not only an incredible success story, but Israel is a beacon of light in an incredibly dangerous region of the world. And yet Israel's humanitarian efforts around the world are just incredible. Can you share with us from your perspective how was such an important job that Israel does in terms of their response to national emergencies around the world, whether it's earthquakes, whether we see tsunamis? The Israelis are first on the scene.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter which part of the world a natural disaster takes place. Israel is always first in the queue to offer their services. Sometimes the receiving countries don't actually want to publicise that Israel has helped them, but they benefit from the skills, expertise, knowledge, particularly in the medical and science areas, to help them get through the problems they're facing at that time. So, you've hit the tip of it. You've touched the tip of the iceberg there, Simon. The problem with Israel and the other countries within the United Nations, the global family, if you like, because all too often everyone wants to focus on Israel's response to the military or terrorist actions that it faces routinely, week in, week out, every single year. And rather than focusing on the really hugely positive story, how many people in Britain realise that when they pick up a prescription from their local pharmacy, that there's a high likelihood that it's come from Teva Pharmaceuticals in Israel. And in terms of the developing world, I was very lucky to have visited a number of countries during my time in Parliament with the International Development Select Committee. And I saw firsthand the use of drip irrigation in India, where previously land which had been infertile and couldn't be used for crops was now turned into a very fertile and abundant opportunities for developing food growth in countries that suffer from having difficulties in terms of the climate that they exist in. So, there's all those sorts of things that Israel does. And you know something? It doesn't blow its trumpet enough. And that's why the Israel-Britain Alliance and their supporters throughout the country want to make sure that we can keep on blowing the trumpet for Israel, explaining to people the valuable contribution that is made to the world family. And in terms of any mistakes that it has made since 1948, and they are minimal compared to the positive contributions that it's made to the world, then we should recognise the whole nation of Israel and the contribution it has made to the global family.
And sadly, when we, whether it's in Parliament or whether it's Western governments or whether it's the Western media or global institutions like the European Union or the United Nations, sadly, everyone sees Israel through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And yet Israel has done more to reach out to peace with their Arab neighbors than the Palestinians have themselves, constantly rejecting Israel's offers for peace. And I think it was Israel's former foreign minister and ambassador to the UN, Abri Ban, said that the Arabs never fail to miss an opportunity, and they constantly miss opportunities for peace. Can you explain to us, as when you were a member of Parliament and you visited, for example, the Palestinian Authority, their complete rejection of any moves towards peace or even recognition of Israel's right to exist, and yet they wouldn't have their own entity now if it wasn't for Israel. They wouldn't have electricity, they wouldn't have schools, they wouldn't have roads, they wouldn't have water, they probably wouldn't even have jobs, and they wouldn't certainly have a huge income coming from Israel if it wasn't for the Israel. Because when the Egyptians were in control of Gaza and when Jordan was in control of Judea and Samaria, or as the world likes to call it, the West Bank, was under their control, they did nothing for Palestinian statehood or independence. What are your thoughts?
Well, can I just give, maybe unusual, but can I give you just a sense of what it's like in the Judea and Samaria and, as you say, what the world calls the West Bank? When you transfer from Israel into the West Bank, then the first thing you notice, this might be a silly thing, but it's just the filth, the rubbish in the streets. There's no pride in the place in which where they live. And I find that utterly extraordinary because there's nothing. I mean, people listening to this, watching this program, many of them will have come from humble beginnings, and they're doing well in life now, and they'll remember how their parents looked after them when they were young, when maybe money was short. But people, and I was in those circumstances. We weren't in poverty, but it was 5 kids, and it would be Michael's turns for shoes 1 month, Kathleen's another, Delia, Brian, Claire, and we would have to recognise that we didn't have money every day to get the things that we would have wanted. Perhaps we'd call them luxuries now. But in terms of the land where the Palestinians are now in control, they don't even look after that. And then when you then speak to the leaders, what really hits you, just from a human perspective, is that they don't care about using their people as cannon fodder. They are prepared to wait another century, another 2 centuries, to have their goal and succeed in their ambition to destroying Israel as a nation in order that they can have one land called Palestine, which is utterly ironic because when Israel is referred to as a colonial entity by people who despise it, which is clearly not true, calling yourself Palestine, which was a name given by the Romans when they took over the lands in 70 AD, then they're actually wanting to name their new country by the same name used as one of the first colonial conquerors. So there's a strange set of contradictions going on in terms of how the Palestinians see themselves. But the fundamental issue for me is they don't want peace. And I keep on, and you probably heard me saying this on the show before, but when I met the Palestinian negotiators in 2014, I had a private conversation with them, and I asked them if the Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat deal was put back on the table with 2014 prices, in other words, that the compensation figures would be increased, would you accept it? And the answer came there, none. And I now refer to that as a tyranny of silence. When you've got your opponent on the ropes, because they can't answer a question not because they don't want to answer the question, simply because you won't like the answer, because they do not want peace.
And Michael, you do incredible work with Israel-Britain Alliance in mobilising grassroots support for Israel politically, so that our government and our parliament knows how much support there is for Israel, particularly amongst the Christian evangelical community. Why is it so important that our viewers get involved politically, that they write to their members of parliament, that they write to their government? Because believe it or not, under the leadership of Boris Johnson, we have the most pro-Israel government probably in British history, certainly over the last 72 years. So how important is it that we continue our support for Israel where it matters, and that is in the corridors of power of this nation?
Well, I've just found out today, Simon, that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign have been successful in court in the UK and have won their case very recently, which says that local government can legitimately disinvest in Israel. You remember the government tried to ban that. They've now lost that court. And so the next test of the Boris Johnson government is that they must now put in place legislation to outlaw that. And that will be a big test for the government. But in a wider front, what we've touched upon today in terms of the 72nd birthday celebrations is that Israel had to defeat its opponents in 1948, 1967, 1973, and then it had to face all the terrorist threats and see them off as well. The next battle won't be a big set-piece military battle like 48 and 67, 73, or it won't be terrorism either. The next battle will be in the International Criminal Court, where the Palestinians and those that support them will attempt to suggest that Israel has behaved illegally by breaking international law and behaving and acting in a disproportionate way when they are defending themselves. And the whole idea is that Israel will be discouraged from taking action against their enemies, people attacking them, and they will leave themselves vulnerable at one of those moments from the Palestinians to break up the state of Israel. So that's why the propaganda war is so important, because the Israel-Britain Alliance is best placed. Everybody's got great ideas and we can take those ideas in, but we are in a great position where we can take a lot of information in and decide where the biggest threats are, and then move to defend Israel in that propaganda war to ensure that organisations like the International Criminal Court can misuse the powers they've been given, which they're currently doing, because they should only be taking on board cases from states, and there is not a state of Palestine in existence in 2020, and looks unlikely that that state's going to become into reality anytime soon. So that's why the support of our Christian friends across the country is so vital. Of course, we take support from anywhere. We take support from the secular community. We take support, of course, from our Jewish friends in the Jewish community. But we have to focus even stronger in 2020 to see off this threat.
Absolutely, and you know you have my support and endorsement for that. If we look and see where Israel is today, 72 years on from a nation being reborn, actually born on one single day, on the 14th of May, 1948, that Israel was surrounded by enemies that wanted to destroy her, and yet today Israel has peace with Jordan, Israel has peace with Egypt, and we see that Saudi Arabia is moving towards reconciliation with Israel, the Gulf states. We also saw that last year, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Oman. And also we see that one of Israel's sworn enemies, Sudan, the leader of Sudan, recently met with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And we're seeing that many of the moderate Sunni Arab states are now beginning to recognize that Israel's going nowhere, and in order for their own security in the region against a very, very hostile Iran that is in pursuit of nuclear weapons, is supporting international terrorism, and is causing huge human rights abuses in their own country, that the only one true democracy and military strength comes from Israel. And these facts are extraordinary. How much do you think this is actually lost on British and European public opinion and governments when they realise that the realities of the Middle East are very different from they were, say, even 5 years ago?
Well, I don't think they hear about it often enough, and that's the key flaw, Simon, because what happens is the Hamas, Islamic Jihad, create a dispute, normally from Gaza, privately or quietly supported by the Palestinian Authority and Fatah officials, including President Abbas, who's now in the 15th or 16th year of his 4-year term as the leader of that particular authority. And the situation is that they start the violence. Israel defends itself as it has every right to do as a sovereign nation. And then what happens is that they face the vitriol, the state of Israel faces the vitriol for defending itself. And then we have the whole communities that support the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is normally an amalgamation of Muslim support in the UK and the hard left, who despise what they believe is a colonial entity in the shape of the State of Israel. They combine, they're marching down Whitehall in their tens of thousands, demanding that the government do something. And in the past, governments have been so weak, they've capitulated to this pressure. And I'm hoping now that with Boris Johnson's leadership unequivocally supporting Israel, that we won't have to see weak responses from the British government and from the British Foreign Office. Dominic Raab, I have to say, does worry me, because he's not always said things that are particularly supportive in times of trouble. And equally, I'm not got much faith in the new shadow foreign affairs team with Lisa Nandy at its helm, given that she has most recently been the head of Labour Friends of Palestine in the Middle East. Claims to be pro-Zionist, claims to be pro-Israel, but everything she's ever done to date has been has run against those particular words that she said. So the challenges are still there, they're massive, and we have to turn the tide by demonstrating that there are thousands and thousands of people in our country who support the State of Israel, who believe that our relationship as a country with the State of Israel is extremely important. And yeah, it can be criticised because Benjamin Netanyahu will make mistakes.
Absolutely.
Every single leader in the Democrat.
Yeah, Michael, I just thank you so much for staying with us and being my guest on The Late Show. Looking forward to having you back on the programme soon, particularly when we can talk about your new campaign, which is to end the 75 years of failure carried out by UNRWA.
Thank you very much, Simon, and best of luck to everybody at Revelation TV, and for everyone else, please keep safe.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for watching the programme. All I can say is to Israel, Yom Haledet, which in Hebrew means happy birthday, as the nation of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide celebrate Israel's 72nd birthday. And what's so extraordinary about this is that this is a nation that has been reborn out of nothing, that this was a desert land that was dead, and it came alive. And we have the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and the God of Israel to thank for that, for bringing his people home, as he said in his word. So we can rest and be assured that God fulfills his word and his promises. So I want to thank you for watching The Late Show, and shalom and God bless from me.